The secret airbase on the Soviet Far East does not reveal itself through geography or scenery, but through the pressure of its routines, the way every movement has a designated corridor, every conversation an acceptable duration, and every departure or return a recorded entry whose handwriting is monitored as closely as the content. The late 1970s exert their own discipline on the place, expressed not in ideology but in the patterns of Cold War bureaucracy that structure the working day. Personnel walk with deliberate pace, not hurried but never slow enough to suggest idleness. Doors are opened and closed according to schedules that are never written down but are universally known. A guard checking documents at the entrance to the administrative block never looks up, yet always notices when someone arrives 2 minutes earlier or later than usual. Routines are enforced not through announcements but through the expectation that everyone already knows them, and that deviation is a form of unwanted attention. Within this environment, Captain Alexei Gromov emerges not as a protagonist but as another component in the institutional machinery. He enters the narrative by fulfilling procedures that define his presence more clearly than any description could. His pre-flight checks follow an unbroken pattern: the same order, the same gestures to verify instruments, the same pause before initialing a form that requires no thought yet demands absolute correctness. His signature is always placed at the same angle on the page, neither too assertive nor too tentative, and the officers who review documents recognize his handwriting before seeing his name. In briefings, he waits the correct number of seconds before stepping forward to receive materials, displays the expected attentiveness without appearing overly invested, and responds to Colonel Sirov's instructions with the tone of someone who has learned the cost of elaboration. Nothing in his behavior calls for scrutiny. Nothing invites interpretation. Colonel Sirov appears in the story by virtue of how others respond to him. His instructions are short, and his silence between sentences is long enough to indicate that additional questions are unwelcome. He does not raise his voice. He raises expectations. Personnel straighten their posture when he enters a room not because he demands it, but because his presence makes deviations from protocol seem dangerously conspicuous. He relies on the stability of procedures, using them as a framework through which he channels authority. When he hands over reconnaissance objectives to Gromov, he does so with a precision that avoids any ambiguity about the mission's requirements but offers no insight into the reasons behind them. His tone communicates that the reasons are beyond the scope of the recipient's need to know. Anna Kravitz, the cryptographer, enters the narrative through brief exchanges that occur at predictable intervals near the communications office. Her words are economical, sometimes reduced to syllables that only carry meaning within the context of a shared environment. She hands coded messages to Gromov or receives sealed envelopes from him without unnecessary commentary. Their conversations resemble transactions shaped by surveillance, controlled, concise, and structured by the awareness that misunderstandings attract attention, but elaborations attract more. Her presence illustrates the tension between routine and caution. She follows procedures with the practiced calm of someone who knows that mistakes are not forgiven through explanation, only through the absence of detection. The engineers in the photo lab appear not as personalities but as synchronized movements in a constrained workspace. They work in pairs, rarely speaking during development cycles unless a technical step requires verbal confirmation. Their gloves are put on and removed with identical gestures. Their notes are made in standardized abbreviations that have evolved over years of repetition, and their cooperation forms a predictable rhythm. Only when procedures shift do their reactions reveal the extent to which they rely on the stability of routine. A longer pause before loading a film reel, a glance exchanged without context, a hesitation before handing over a developed strip. These small deviations carry weight in a place where silence is the default mode of communication. Their discomfort becomes a sign that something has disturbed the procedural equilibrium. The base's routines are not introduced through descriptive passages but through accumulated observations of how people move, speak, or refrain from speaking. The morning begins with a succession of quietly closing doors, the sound of stamped pages in the operations office, and the controlled murmur of officers reviewing flight paths with no intention of disclosing anything beyond operational necessity. Lunch occurs on an unspoken schedule, with shifts arranged so that no group gathers large enough to attract attention. Even pauses in the hallway are timed by habit. Lingering too long suggests avoidance or curiosity, both of which carry risks. Personnel acquire their habits through years of institutional reinforcement, and newcomers adapt quickly or disappear quietly. Into this context comes the first irregularity, small enough to be dismissed but large enough to disrupt a pattern. A flight log temporarily disappears from its folder. The clerk responsible for maintaining the files replaces it without comment, but his movements afterward become sharper, his transitions between tasks more rigid, as if compensating for an error he cannot acknowledge. Gromov, retrieving the log later, notices the faint crease on the page where it has been handled out of sequence. He does not comment. He signs his section with the same consistent handwriting he always uses and returns the file to its place, but the brief pause before closing the drawer shows that he has registered the deviation. The second irregularity occurs in the photo lab. A developed reel remains on the table for several seconds longer than protocol allows before the engineer places it in the correct tray. The delay is subtle but enough for the second engineer to shift his stance, a gesture so slight that only someone accustomed to the room's usual choreography would detect it. When Gromov arrives to collect the completed materials, the engineers avoid unnecessary eye contact, maintaining a level of precision that feels rehearsed rather than natural. Nothing is said, but the weight of what could be said hangs between them like an unsent message. The third irregularity is the change in briefing order. Colonel Serov delivers instructions in the usual tone, but the sequence is altered. Secondary objectives are mentioned before primary ones, and supplementary materials are handed out before the main packet. The officers present react with controlled expressions that reveal nothing, but their silence becomes more focused than usual. Gromov receives his folder and steps back exactly as protocol dictates, yet the shift in routine lingers in the air. The briefing ends abruptly, earlier than expected, with Serov dismissing the group in a voice that contains no explanation. No one asks for one. These procedural disruptions accumulate without dramatic framing. The base continues functioning as it always has, but the small distortions in routine act as early indications that the operational system is reacting to something it cannot openly address. Personnel move with slightly more caution, conversations conclude one sentence earlier than necessary, and documents are checked twice before being handed over. Nothing is explicitly wrong. Everything remains officially normal. Yet the institutional machinery is adjusting itself as if preparing for pressure that has not yet arrived, but is sensed through the misalignment of once reliable patterns. Gromov navigates this environment with the reflex of someone trained to avoid drawing conclusions prematurely. He notices the missing log, the hesitation in the photo lab, the altered briefing, and the tension in the cryptography office, but he registers these details the way a pilot registers slight variances on an instrument panel, by noting them, filing them mentally, and waiting to see whether they form a pattern. His interactions remain steady, his responses measured, his compliance with procedure absolute. But the way he waits an extra moment before locking his flight folder in the metal cabinet, the way he checks his identification badge twice instead of once when passing through the guarded entrance, and the way he glances toward a corridor he normally ignores all indicate an awareness of a shift that has no name. Anna Kravitz senses the tension through changes in how documents are routed. A message that should have arrived through the internal courier system is delivered in person by an officer who normally avoids the cryptography wing. Her name appears written in a different hand on a routing slip. During one exchange with Gromov, her usual concise phrasing becomes even more economical, shaped by the fear that too many words might draw attention to a situation she cannot define. She returns to her desk and resumes her work with the rigid posture of someone attempting to return to normalcy through sheer discipline. Colonel Serov remains composed, but small adjustments in his behavior signal that he is managing pressures beyond the visible workflow. He spends an additional minute reviewing Gromov's mission notes, places his pen on the table at a slightly sharper angle, and ends a briefing without the customary closing remark he uses to signal procedural completion. Officers observe these deviations with professional silence, aligning their own routines around his altered patterns as if recalibrating the base's internal structure. In the photo lab, the engineers adhere even more strictly to protocol, suggesting that stability must be recreated through exaggerated precision. Their movements become clipped, their pauses shorter, their transitions between tasks nearly mechanical. When Gromov collects the next batch of developed film, the handoff is executed with a formality that feels too deliberate to be routine. The engineers maintain the fiction of normalcy, but their silence communicates that something in the images has introduced instability into a system that depends on certainty. These shifts in behavior accumulate quietly. No alarms are sounded. No formal statements are issued. The base continues its operations, flights are launched and recovered, documents circulated and archived, and personnel follow their schedules. Yet the weight of the unacknowledged anomaly presses inward, reshaping routines not through orders but through silent, collective adjustment. The environment itself becomes the narrator of unease, signaling through its altered rhythms that the threat is already present, even if no one has yet articulated its nature. By the time the first official hint of concern appears, a slight delay in the processing of reconnaissance materials, accompanied by a note requesting verification of timestamps, the institutional fabric has already adapted to the pressure. People speak less, walk more quickly between buildings, and complete paperwork with an attention to detail that borders on defensive. The secret airbase, normally defined by rigid predictability, begins to display the early symptoms of uncertainty, revealing that something has entered its routines that cannot be processed through standard channels. The world of the base introduces itself not through decoration or explanation, but through the friction between what should happen and what does. The quiet threat emerges from the tension between procedure and deviation, from the way a misplaced document or altered briefing disrupts an entire ecosystem. The narrative settles into this tension, allowing the environment to articulate what no character dares speak, that the anomaly is already part of the system, and that its presence is reshaping the structure of life on the airbase before anyone has acknowledged it aloud. The irregularities surrounding the photograph begin to assert themselves not as isolated disruptions but as a slow, systemic distortion of daily procedure. The base's routines, once executed with unthinking regularity, now carry an undercurrent of hesitation. Conversations that formerly adhered to predictable cadences acquire small gaps and careful omissions, as though speakers have begun editing their sentences mid-breath. Officers passing in hallways no longer exchange brief nods as markers of acknowledgement. Instead, they avert their eyes a moment too early or look a moment too long, searching for cues that no one is willing to articulate. The sense of monitored speech extends beyond official rooms, shaping interactions even in the short transit between buildings where surveillance is less likely but never impossible. Doors that were typically open during designated work periods are found locked without explanation, with the keys held by individuals who seem uncertain when questioned, uncertain not because they lack information, but because they are measuring the risk of responding incorrectly. These changes do not come with announcements. They manifest through the accumulation of contradictions: a door closed when protocol requires access, a meeting delayed without reason, a file relocated from its usual cabinet shelf to a drawer where it does not belong. Personnel adjust to the distortions with professional discipline, but the need to adjust at all signals a shift that the institution has not endorsed and cannot conceal. In the photo lab, the engineers develop the next sets of reconnaissance film with an attentiveness that borders on rigidity. Their movements retain the practiced synchronization of their routine tasks, yet their restraint is visible in the way they handle the materials. Gloves are pulled tighter than necessary, trays are placed precisely at the center of the table, and any accidental contact with equipment triggers a too-quick correction. When they hand the prints to Gromov, they do so in a manner that avoids eye contact, as though acknowledging him would require acknowledging the presence of something in the images they cannot discuss. The silence is heavier than before. It has become not just procedural but protective.
Colonel se refait briefing gros shorter.
He no longer explains the hierarchical structure of objectives nor comments on the weather patterns over the designated sectors. Instead, he issues mandates in compressed form, flight altitudes delivered without context, timing windows stated with a severity that discourages any request for clarification. The officers gathered around the briefing table respond with the attentiveness expected of them, yet even their posture suggests uncertainty. They stand slightly straighter, shoulders tense, as though anticipating additional orders that never arrive. Sirov's glances across the room last a fraction longer, as if assessing each officer's level of comprehension or compliance. The absence of explanation becomes its own form of scrutiny. Anna Kravitz begins adjusting her daily route through the administrative wing. She walks longer paths between her office and the communication center, seemingly choosing routes that pass fewer open doors. When Gromov meets her near the stairwell, her voice is even quieter than usual, each syllable delivered with care. She waits for footsteps to fade before handing over encoded materials. The exchange lasts only seconds, but her hesitation before departing, just a momentary stillness, signals that she has registered the base's altered atmosphere with the precision of someone trained to detect anomalies in patterns. She avoids offices where officers linger without clear purpose, where the soft hum of typewriters is paused, where doors remain half open as though waiting for someone to enter or to stay away. Guards appear in hallways that have never required them. No new directive is issued, and no announcement explains the shift, yet their presence is unmistakable. A uniformed man whose duty normally involves the perimeter now stands at the entrance to the operations archive, his expression neutral but his posture too rigid to be routine. Another guard, usually stationed near the vehicle depot, occupies a silent position near the stairwell leading to the second-floor conference rooms. These placements alter the natural flow of personnel. People move more cautiously, reluctant to pass through areas that once served as simple transitions between workspaces. The guards do not speak, but their silence communicates the extent of their orders. Observe everything, acknowledge nothing. Gromov begins to sense that the pressure radiating from these changes is shaping itself into a moral question, though the question has not yet been formed in words. His awareness comes from context rather than contemplation. The unexplained city captured in the reconnaissance photograph has introduced a contradiction into an institution that relies on coherence. His role, defined by duty, precision, and compliance, now intersects with uncertainty that cannot be reconciled through procedure. The pressure emerges through how people react around him, how Anna's tone tightens when she hands him a message, how the engineers withdraw into a stricter version of their routines, how Sirov's instructions carry an intensity that implies withheld information. The idea that the anomaly should be concealed, perhaps for the protection of those around him, is not expressed outright. It is encoded in the avoidance of questions, in the way personnel glance at the developed photographs only long enough to confirm their contents but never long enough to form interpretations. It is present in the fact that no one asks for the full set of negatives, even though standard protocol requires multiple officers to verify them. At the same time, Gromov recognizes that failing to report the anomaly in its entirety could provoke accusations that extend far beyond procedural reprimand. Silence can protect, but it can also incriminate when the institution demands transparency. The moral question grows in the space between these outcomes, gaining weight through the restrained behavior of those who understand that acknowledging too much or too little can produce consequences. The base's procedures continue to distort as documents vanish and reappear without comment. A folder that should contain 3 forms contains only 2. An operation schedule posted in the hallway updates itself overnight with alterations that no one claims responsibility for. A requisition form submitted by Gromov returns stamped and approved but bears a different signature than the officer assigned to that duty. Personnel avoid discussing these inconsistencies, not because they fail to notice them, but because speaking them aloud would imply involvement in matters beyond their jurisdiction. The world constricts around the unresolved contradiction of the city no map acknowledges. Conversations shorten. Footsteps quicken. Papers are handled with a delicacy that suggests their contents have grown more volatile. The pressure is collective yet unspoken, an environmental force that disciplines every gesture and suppresses every impulse toward speculation. The shifts within the base unfolded with an almost biological slowness, as if the institution itself were adjusting its posture in reaction to the photograph. What had once been a predictable environment governed by routine now resembled a sealed system subtly altering its internal chemistry. Patterns that had defined the daily rhythm began dissolving, replaced by an uncanny sense that the familiar was now acting with intentions concealed beneath its surface. Nothing happened abruptly, yet everything seemed to be tilting away from its expected trajectory, creating the impression that even the walls had begun to observe and interpret those who moved within them. Gromov felt these distortions first in the way colleagues navigated around him. People who once greeted him with a neutral confidence now carried a faint stiffness in their movements, a deliberate caution in how they positioned themselves in corridors or at the tables in the intelligence wing. Their glances rarely aligned directly with his, and when they did, the contact was fleeting, almost apologetic, as though each of them was silently negotiating the risk of being seen acknowledging the significance of the photograph. The technical personnel who handled reconnaissance materials behaved with an unfamiliar restraint, lifting reels with unnecessary gentleness, marking documents with strokes so measured they resembled ceremonial gestures rather than routine annotation. Even the engineers, notorious for their loud debates over trivial specifications, worked in subdued concentration, their voices reduced to a level that suggested an external presence capable of misinterpreting any careless word. The base had always operated under a veneer of controlled tension, but this was different. It no longer resembled discipline imposed from above. Instead, it felt like an atmospheric pressure shaping thought itself. Briefings became compressed into statements devoid of orientation, leaving officers to interpret them through instinct rather than instruction. The administrative pathways, once open arteries of movement, adopted qualities of a labyrinth designed to channel each person into deliberate, surveilled routes. Doors that had remained unlocked for as long as Gromov could remember now required keys that were never formally issued. Locks clicked behind personnel with the precision of a stage mechanism resetting its scenery, and no one commented on these shifts, perhaps because any remark would imply awareness of an anomaly that could not be safely named. Anna Kravitz's behavior reflected the new order with a clarity that allowed Gromov to recognize how deeply the transformation had infiltrated daily procedures. Her movement through the administrative wing adopted a complex pattern of rerouted steps, choosing longer hallways and narrower staircases, avoiding offices where solitary officers lingered with a watchfulness that exceeded their official duties. Her detours were subtle enough to avoid suspicion, yet consistent enough to indicate that she, too, perceived the tightening institutional grip. If Gromov once believed her role granted her a stable perspective within the administrative hierarchy, The shifts in her routine exposed how the hierarchy itself was dissolving into a structure governed by uncertainty. The air of controlled fear that had begun as a faint undertone gradually expanded until it framed every action, creating the sense that each gesture could carry unintended consequences. No official order had been issued, yet the collective behavior of the personnel revealed a shared understanding. The photograph represented something that threatened not only protocol but the very logic of their operational world. The image of the unmapped city stood as a contradiction incapable of being processed by ordinary channels, and this impossibility infused each person with a silent dread of being connected to it. Even documents unrelated to the reconnaissance mission were handled with increased caution, pages turned slowly, annotations minimized, as if the act of writing itself risked leaving a trace that could later be interpreted as knowledge. The photochemical laboratory, once a sanctuary of precision and neutrality, reflected the same expanding unease. The meticulous arrangement of trays, clamps, drying lines, and storage boxes lost its sense of mechanical order. Film strips appeared in unexpected configurations, hung at irregular intervals, with some reels indexed twice and others not at all. Tools were placed at slightly altered angles, as though hands paused mid-action and reconsidered the implications of leaving anything too neatly aligned. The usual laboratory soundscape, the steady drip of solution, the soft hum of an extractor, seemed to change its rhythm, taking on a pulse that reacted to the unspoken tension permeating the room. Personnel moved through the space with a restraint bordering on reverence, each of them behaving as though their presence might disturb a fragile equilibrium. What unsettled Gromov most was how the transformation reached beyond the physical routines into cognitive processes. Thoughts he would normally dismiss began returning with persistent clarity, as if the environment itself were prompting him to reconsider details he had previously overlooked. He noticed patterns in the deletion and reappearance of documents, not in their content but in the timing and the manner in which they resurfaced. Files would vanish overnight and return the next day with minor formatting differences, margins slightly adjusted, binding holes misaligned, pages reordered yet still containing the same information. These inconsistencies did not suggest simple clerical mistakes but rather a controlled system of silent evaluation, one that sought to verify who had accessed what and when. It became impossible to determine whether the reordering was intended to confuse the personnel, test their reactions, or simply maintain an illusion of organizational normalcy. The moral question that had begun forming in Gromov's mind, whether to conceal the photograph or report it fully, no longer emerged from personal reflection alone. It was being shaped by the institution itself, which seemed determined to force the dilemma upon him by stripping away any possibility of neutral action. The more the environment constricted, the more he sensed that any decision he made would be interpreted through a lens of suspicion. Reporting the photograph in full could mark him as someone attempting to bypass internal authority. Concealing it, even partially, could be framed as an act of deliberate misinformation. The institution, by tightening its grip, eliminated the distinction between caution and disloyalty, leaving him with a burden that felt engineered rather than accidental. Yet the most striking transformation lay in the behavior of the base's documentation systems. Logs, rosters, and operational summaries began to display subtle inconsistencies that no one acknowledged aloud. Entries time-stamped at hours when no personnel should have been working appeared in clean handwriting, suggesting an observer who operated outside conventional schedules. Machine-typed pages alternated with handwritten lines in unfamiliar scripts. Charts were updated with symbols that matched no official designation. These peculiarities accumulated until it became evident that someone, or something embedded within the administrative apparatus, had begun manipulating the informational structure. Whether the purpose was concealment, reconstruction, or testing the personnel's capacity for perception, Gromov could not determine, but he understood instinctively that the photograph had triggered a chain reaction far beyond conventional protocol. The hallways themselves began to feel narrower, though dimensions had not changed. It was the way people moved through them, hugging walls, pausing before turning corners, scanning reflective surfaces as though expecting to catch their own gestures interpreted by an unseen observer. Windows that once displayed the open expanse of the steppe now seemed like surfaces separating two incompatible realities, with the landscape beyond appearing slightly duller, as if viewed through glass not entirely transparent. Even the base's lighting shifted in tone. The fluorescence flickered less frequently but cast a colder, more severe glow, accentuating angles and flattening shadows in a way that made every object appear scrutinized. By this point, the unresolved existence of the unmapped city had become the silent organizer of the base's behavior. Its absence from all records rendered it a gravitational center, a point of impossibility pulling every routine slightly out of alignment. No one spoke of it, yet everything responded to it. Even those unaware of its existence indirectly mirrored the broader atmosphere of controlled caution, as if the institution transmitted tension through its infrastructure. The transformation reached a point where the base no longer felt like a military installation but like a closed system studying itself. Every gesture, document movement, and procedural shift seemed to feed into an invisible loop of observation. The personnel, knowingly or not, had become components of an organism recalibrating itself in response to an anomaly it could not classify. Gromov realized, with a clarity both frightening and strangely inevitable, that the institution had crossed a threshold. It was no longer reacting to the photograph. It was preparing for something larger, something that the appearance of the Phantom City had merely exposed. The escalation of institutional tension did not erupt in a burst of alarms or confrontations. Instead, it unfolded through a gradual infiltration of documentary fragments into the fabric of daily operations, as if the base itself had begun producing a parallel narrative that contradicted its official facade. These documents did not appear as separate inserts but fused seamlessly into the unfolding environment, blurring the line between lived routine and bureaucratic observation. A partially redacted memo surfaced first, slipped into a stack of flight paperwork with the deliberate anonymity characteristic of internal audits. Its annotations questioned minor discrepancies in Gromov's recorded flight path, variations in altitude so slight that no human error could reasonably account for them. Yet the memo treated the irregularities as intentional deviations, implying that the aircraft had responded to coordinates not present on any map. The memo's tone was clinical, but beneath the precision lay a suspicion that did not need to name itself. Its presence alone established a new layer of surveillance, one that suggested the institution had begun examining Gromov not as an operator within protocol but as a variable in an emerging anomaly. Shortly after, a transcript from a brief interrogation appeared within a packet of maintenance reports, its position so unremarkable that it might have gone unnoticed if not for the faint carbon impressions marking its edges. The transcript recorded the account of one of the engineers from the photochemical laboratory. Without explicit commentary, the text revealed subtle inconsistencies between what the engineer stated during film development and what established procedures declared possible. The wording was clipped, transcribed with the restraint of someone determined to extract a coherent narrative from incompatible observations. The engineer's account referred indirectly to brightness levels on the negative that exceeded the expected range for the time of day, implying illumination sources inconsistent with the terrain over which Gromov's aircraft had flown. The transcript did not accuse anyone directly. It merely juxtaposed statements with regulatory expectations, creating an unresolved tension that settled over the laboratory like a fine layer of dust. Another document emerged in the form of a draft internal incident report, its margins marked with revision symbols used by administrative units responsible for classifying sensitive material. The report referenced unverified imagery without specifying its content, framing the anomaly as a procedural irregularity rather than a threat. Yet the careful avoidance of descriptive detail carried its own meaning, implying that the mere act of reducing the photograph to bureaucratic terminology represented a risk. Even in draft form, the report behaved as a vessel of uncertainty, a written acknowledgement that some element of the institution's internal logic had been challenged by evidence it could not categorize. As these fragments accumulated, contradictions became increasingly difficult to ignore. They did not align into a coherent accusation or a discernible narrative. Instead, they formed a dispersed pattern of unease, each document reinforcing the sense that the institution was struggling to maintain its unity of purpose. The personnel who encountered these materials responded with rigid composure, but the stiffness of their behavior revealed an underlying anxiety about being associated with any document that deviated from standard expectations. The culture of the base had begun shifting toward a mode in which silence served not only as protection but as an acknowledgement of the instability underlying every official claim. Colonel Serov emerged as a central figure within this climate of conflicting loyalties. His behavior maintained the outward discipline expected of his position, yet signs of internal conflict filtered through the structural rigidity of his actions. His instructions grew increasingly truncated, delivered with the brevity of someone attempting to fulfill obligations while limiting opportunities for misinterpretation. Late-night meetings, once reserved for exceptional operational needs, became more frequent, though their outcomes were never recorded in official logs. These gatherings carried the atmosphere of events that occurred on the threshold between sanctioned procedure and private contingency, as if Serov were attempting to insulate his subordinates from institutional forces he could no longer fully predict. His posture conveyed commitment to the organization, yet the narrowing of his directives and the unusual timing of his activities suggested an unspoken concern for those working beneath him, a concern that took shape not in words but in patterns of behavior shaped to minimize exposure. Within this tightening environment, Anna Kravitz assumed a role shaped by subtlety rather than authority. Her position within the cryptographic division afforded her access to classification systems that operated beneath the surface of ordinary protocol. When she approached Gromov, never directly, never in a manner that suggested deliberate communication, her presence signaled a shift in classification codes assigned to his reconnaissance materials. These shifts appeared minor in the administrative ledger, mere adjustments of letters and numbers, yet they indicated that the materials had been reassigned to an internal tier associated with heightened scrutiny. The implication was not only that the institution was observing Gromov, but that it had begun observing itself through the lens of his materials. The reclassification carried an atmosphere of self-surveillance, as if the base were preparing for the possibility that its own procedural architecture might fail to encompass the anomaly. The base's physical environment echoed this institutional unease. Rooms were reassigned without explanation, their numbers altered in ways that disrupted the coherence of spatial memory. Offices that had been occupied by the same personnel for years suddenly hosted unfamiliar faces, while previous occupants relocated to distant sections of the base with no recorded rationale for the change. The lighting system, normally maintained with unsparing precision, began to malfunction in isolated sections, flickering with irregular intervals that lent the corridors an uncertain rhythm. These disruptions were not severe enough to justify technical intervention, yet they accumulated into a sensory landscape that resembled a controlled destabilization of the familiar. Even the communications network showed signs of strain. Radio channels that had remained stable for years began to fill with intermittent static at moments when clarity was essential. This interference did not block communication but weakened its reliability, forcing operators to repeat transmissions with increasing formality, as though the act of reiteration might stabilize the underlying system. The static emerged unpredictably, aligning with no detectable environmental pattern, creating a sense that the communications network was responding to pressures not acknowledged by any official technical assessment. All these elements, documentary contradictions, administrative distortions, sensory disruptions, began converging toward the central discovery implicit in the photograph, though no single event announced its approach. The narrative trajectory of the base did not shift through revelation but through the cumulative weight of inconsistencies that rendered stable explanations increasingly untenable. Each document raised a question that no one could articulate. Each behavioral shift implied a tension that exceeded the scope of ordinary protocol, and each malfunction underscored the fragility of the institution's internal coherence. The base, through its paperwork, its personnel, and its physical systems, began acknowledging the existence of something it could not define. The unmapped city did not reappear, yet its presence grew more tangible through the distortions forming around its absence. What had begun as a single anomalous photograph now exerted a gravitational pull, drawing the institution into a space where bureaucratic certainty dissolved into a field of unresolved contradictions, strained loyalties, and an emerging awareness that the anomaly was not confined to the image alone but had embedded itself in the very mechanisms designed to contain it. The unveiling of the central discovery did not occur in a single moment but emerged through a gradual alignment of fragments, each one small enough to appear innocuous on its own yet collectively forming a structure that no longer permitted denial. The convergence began when the latest batch of reconnaissance film returned from development, bearing the same standardized markings and identifiers that defined every operation on the base, yet containing within its orderly sequence a frame that duplicated the impossible image already responsible for the tightening atmosphere in every corridor. The second appearance of the unmapped city was not formally registered. No document acknowledged it, no officer discussed it, and no procedure existed to categorize an image that should not have been captured by the camera at all. Yet its presence imposed a gravitational weight that forced the institution's mechanisms to absorb it through silence, denial, and procedural redirection. The laboratory team, usually consistent in their movements, handled the strip with motions that oscillated between excessive caution and mechanical detachment, as though they were attempting to follow protocol while distancing themselves from the implications of their own actions. Their gestures conveyed not panic but a recognition that something irreversible had entered the system. Gromov did not encounter the discovery as a revelation but as a continuation of the tension that had been shaping the environment for days. When the developed film reached him, it carried the familiar scent of chemicals and the residual warmth of the lab's machinery, markers of routine that should have stabilized the experience into predictable order. Instead, the anomaly's reappearance presented itself with the understated force of a fact that had always existed, waiting for acknowledgement. The city's image was clearer this time, with architectural details sharper than before, though its contours remained unanchored to any known geographic logic. Buildings displayed no visible signs of aging, no indicators of construction period or architectural evolution. Streets were arranged with a symmetry that resisted categorization, resembling neither Soviet nor foreign planning principles, and yet the layout maintained a coherence that suggested habitation. The absence of temporal markers was the most unsettling element. Nothing in the image revealed seasonal variation, environmental wear, or traces of past modification. It was a city without time, captured from an angle that Gromov recognized as inconsistent with his recorded flight path. The psychological rupture that followed did not express itself through overt reaction but through the progressive tightening of his physical comportment, the way his hands hovered momentarily above the film as if awaiting a signal that would legitimize engagement with the impossible. The institution observed this reaction not through individuals but through its systems. Classification code shifted again, access thresholds recalibrated, and the logs that tracked document circulation adopted gaps that appeared deliberate. These alterations suggested that the system had entered a state of defensive adaptation, attempting to integrate the anomaly without acknowledging it directly. The bureaucratic apparatus behaved as though the discovery had activated a latent protocol, one that operated beneath the surface of documented procedure and responded to irregularities through obscurity rather than clarity. Colonel Sirov's involvement deepened, not through explicit intervention but through the narrowing of interactions surrounding the anomaly. His presence became more difficult to track, and the times at which he appeared in operational spaces no longer aligned with scheduled activities. His instructions, reduced further in length, carried an implicit directive to maintain order without seeking explanation, as though he recognized that attention posed a greater threat than ignorance. The subtle shifts in his posture, the way he reviewed documents without turning pages, and his increased reliance on verbal summaries conveyed an awareness that the written record was becoming unstable. His behavior suggested a recognition that the institution itself was beginning to fracture under the strain of absorbing information that resisted categorization. Anna Kravitz's role expanded in parallel, though she remained outwardly bound by the strict constraints of her position. Her access to cryptographic systems allowed her to perceive the anomaly's trajectory through the institution more clearly than most. Classification markers associated with Gromov's materials began migrating into sectors typically reserved for information pertaining to geopolitical threats or internal breaches. Yet the anomaly did not fit either category, producing inconsistencies that forced the system to create hybrid codes, combinations that had no precedent. These hybrid codes appeared in tracking logs only briefly before being overwritten, suggesting the involvement of an administrative layer that operated without formal documentation. Anna's behavior reflected this shifting landscape. Her movements became measured not by caution alone but by the need to navigate invisible boundaries that had emerged within administrative structures. She altered the timing of her routine tasks, avoided certain offices without outward justification, and handled documents with a degree of precision that implied an awareness of consequences reaching beyond procedural violation. The psychological rupture within the institution manifested in the physical environment as well. Rooms that had previously served clear purposes were repurposed without explanation. A storage area transformed into an administrative office overnight, with no recorded requisition for furniture or equipment. A communications room, normally active around the clock, stood empty for 2 days, its lights dim yet operational, as though awaiting an undefined function. The changes occurred with the subtle choreography of an institution adapting to an unidentified internal threat, redistributing space and responsibility without acknowledging the source of pressure. These alterations introduced a sense of instability into corridors that had always functioned as symbols of order, transforming familiar routes into uncertain passages defined by shifting thresholds of access. The discovery's impact deepened when subsequent frames on the film revealed faint traces of the same city at different angles, as though the camera had captured multiple perspectives of an object not present in its physical line of sight. The faintness of these images suggested an intermittent presence, something that hovered at the periphery of the camera's capacity to record. This temporal inconsistency created a contradiction that no procedure could reconcile. The images implied not only that the city existed outside map geography, but that it existed outside the temporal framework through which reconnaissance operations were understood. The presence of the city across multiple frames indicated a pattern, yet the pattern revealed no logic that aligned with known phenomena. This uncertainty produced an atmosphere that permeated the base's operations, influencing the behavior of personnel who had not seen the images themselves but sensed the institutional disturbance spreading through altered procedures, reordered priorities, and unspoken prohibitions. The psychological rupture within Gromov intensified as he attempted to integrate the implications of the discovery into the rigid discipline that had shaped his professional identity. His actions became more deliberate, not from fear or confusion but from an instinctive need to maintain coherence in an environment that was losing its structural integrity. His movements through the base reflected a heightened awareness of being observed, though the source of observation remained diffuse, embodied more in the institution's shifting procedures than in any individual. His work routine, once defined by precision and predictability, now felt permeated by variables that resisted measurement. The film's images reoriented his understanding of reconnaissance itself, challenging the foundational assumption that aerial photography captured fixed and verifiable terrain. The influence of the discovery spread into the institutional narrative through subtle changes in record-keeping. Logs that once adhered to strict chronological formatting now contain discrepancies in timestamps, as though the recording system had begun to falter under the pressure of reconciling conflicting information. Documents referenced events that had not yet occurred or omitted entries that should have been recorded. These inconsistencies were not widespread but appeared in areas connected to the anomaly, creating a fragmented administrative trail that mirrored the uncertainty surrounding the discovery. The institution responded by tightening access to these logs, restricting visibility even among personnel with established clearance. This restriction, however, served not to protect information but to prevent the recognition of systemic instability. The climax of the discovery's influence arrived not through confrontation but through the quiet realization that the institution had begun restructuring itself around the anomaly's presence. Personnel assignments shifted without announcement, responsibilities redistributed in patterns that seemed guided by an invisible logic. Those who had been close to the materials associated with the anomaly found themselves transferred to peripheral duties or reassigned to sectors with reduced operational significance. These changes occurred without the usual documentation or formal acknowledgement, as though the institution sought to disperse the anomaly's influence by dissolving the human network surrounding it. Yet this dispersal did not reduce tension. It merely redistributed it across the base, creating pockets of uncertainty that deepened the sense of a system struggling against an internal rupture. As the city's recurring presence on film solidified into an undeniable discovery, the psychological impact within the institution reached a point of controlled fracture. The narrative of the base no longer adhered to a single coherent logic, but became a composite of administrative decisions, undocumented shifts, and silent acknowledgments of an event that resisted interpretation. Gromov stood at the center of this convergence, not as a protagonist but as a vector through which the anomaly entered the institution's structural core. His role was neither chosen nor articulated. It emerged through the intersection of his responsibilities, the materials he handled, and the institution's response to information that threatened to dissolve its conceptual foundations. The rupture, however, did not produce chaos. Instead, it generated a strained equilibrium in which the institution functioned through containment rather than explanation. The discovery was not dismissed, nor was it accepted. It existed in a liminal state, suspended within a network of procedures designed to maintain stability by preventing inquiry. The city on the film remained an image without definition, a presence that distorted the environment through its refusal to fit into any known category. The institution, in turn, adapted through silence, redirection, and the gradual reconfiguration of its internal architecture. In this state of controlled rupture, the base entered a phase of tension that could not be resolved through protocol. The discovery had imposed a new framework in which established categories failed, and the institution's response had become an intricate system of avoidance. Gromov, standing within the center of this shifting landscape, experienced the impact not as a single realization but as a cumulative weight that pressed against every movement, every document handled, every moment of silence in the corridors. The anomaly had become inseparable from the institution itself, not through understanding but through the pressure it exerted on every structural layer, leaving behind a psychological and procedural fracture that defined the shape of the climax. In the aftermath of the discovery, the base continued to function, yet every routine revealed subtle distortions that signaled an internal restructuring shaped by silence rather than acknowledgement, transforming the environment into a space defined not by order but by the measured concealment of what had occurred. The rhythm of daily operations persisted, with personnel moving along corridors in familiar patterns, but their interactions had shifted into a mode of avoidance that suggested a collective agreement to withdraw from the memory of the anomaly. Individuals who had once shared exchanges of procedural familiarity now passed each other with downcast eyes, adopting a form of non-recognition that served as both protection and compliance. The base's administrative architecture reinforced this shift through small but decisive alterations. Rosters displayed missing names without comment, office assignments changed without official announcement, and certain rooms that had previously remained accessible were now locked, their contents reassigned or removed in ways that left no visible trace of prior function. These changes occurred incrementally and without the formal language that typically accompanied operational adjustments, creating an atmosphere in which absence itself became a kind of record, an imprint of decisions made beyond the reach of documentation. Fragmented documentary elements surfaced occasionally within the bureaucratic flow, offering glimpses into an institutional process that sought to absorb the anomaly through procedural finality rather than analysis. A censored follow-up report circulated briefly before being collected again, its heavily redacted sections reducing complex events to a formulaic statement closing the investigation without conclusions, attributing discrepancies to routine inconsistencies and instructing that no further examination was required. The language maintained an appearance of procedural legitimacy, yet the density of omissions revealed the underlying effort to compress the event into an administrative closure. A brief memo issued shortly thereafter reassigned Gromov to temporary administrative duties, citing operational restructuring as justification but offering no indication of duration or purpose. Its tone was neutral, but the absence of detail suggested that the institution had chosen to reposition him not to address the anomaly but to remove him from its trajectory. Another document, a procedural note from the archival division, indicated that the original film reels had been reclassified under a new designation, a category associated with materials retained indefinitely yet seldom accessed, effectively burying the evidence beneath layers of bureaucratic insulation. These documents circulated with the restrained efficiency of a system intent on re-establishing equilibrium, yet their fragmented nature revealed the institution's recognition that equilibrium could be maintained only through controlled erasure. Gromov adapted to the altered environment with a precision that concealed the internal weight of the discovery, moving through his tasks with the disciplined restraint expected of an officer yet carrying within his actions the subtle stiffness of someone navigating an atmosphere defined by unarticulated tension. His reassignment to administrative duties placed him at a remove from the operational spaces where the anomaly had first emerged, yet this distance offered no relief from the institutional pressure. Instead, it introduced a new layer of scrutiny, one that evaluated compliance not through performance but through silence. His days became structured around tasks devoid of significance, tasks that occupied time without contributing to larger objectives, reinforcing the sense that the institution had chosen containment over resolution. His adherence to orders took on a deliberate neutrality, neither enthusiastic nor resistant, as though he had internalized the understanding that deviation of any kind might reactivate attention better left dormant. His presence in the administrative wing became part of the new procedural landscape, a reminder of events the institution had chosen to bury but not forget. Colonel Serov maintained his authoritative posture, yet his behavior reflected a narrowing of scope that suggested he had been repositioned within the institutional hierarchy, granted responsibility only within clearly delineated areas that avoided any connection to reconnaissance. His briefings became narrower in focus, emphasizing standard procedures without contextual elaboration, as though he were fulfilling the minimal requirements of leadership while avoiding entanglement with anything that might invoke the memory of the anomaly. His avoidance of reconnaissance topics was not overt but embedded within the structure of his actions, his shift in movements, and his reluctance to engage with materials beyond their surface function. His presence carried the weight of someone who understood the limits of permissible attention, navigating the environment with an awareness shaped not by fear but by the recognition that the institution had redefined its boundaries around an event that remained unspoken. The authority he projected was intact, yet its foundation had shifted, supported less by institutional trust and more by the necessity of maintaining order through conformity. Anna Kravitz's interactions underwent a similar contraction, reduced to brief exchanges dictated by necessity rather than familiarity. Her movements through the administrative corridors reflected an increased sensitivity to surveillance, though she displayed no outward sign of distress. Instead, her restraint suggested an understanding that the institution now monitored not just information but the patterns of those associated with the anomaly. The route she chose, the timing of her tasks, and the precision with which she handled classified materials indicated that she had adjusted to the new structural constraints, adopting a calibrated neutrality that prevented her from drawing attention. Her awareness of classification codes, once a tool for maintaining operational clarity, now functioned as a signal of where not to tread, as new categories emerged that could not be interpreted through normal procedural logic. Her presence in the narrative became quieter, shaped by the discipline of someone whose proximity to the anomaly had placed her within an unspoken category of risk. The discovery itself remained unresolved at an institutional level, not through denial but through the systematic rechanneling of processes that erased opportunities for inquiry. Daily routines continued, but the informal spaces where personnel once exchanged observations or speculated about irregularities had dissolved into silence, replaced by an atmosphere in which even neutral conversation carried the potential to draw scrutiny. The tension embedded within the base's environment persisted not in overexpressions but in the subtle distortions of behavior, the careful avoidance of topics that once formed the backbone of operational discussion, and the internalization of boundaries that no document had defined. The base functioned through a collective discipline that transformed lived experience into a series of controlled gestures, each one calibrated to avoid the reactivation of a suppressed event. The anomaly's presence became embedded not in documents or images but in the absence of discourse, the deliberate omissions that structured every action. The physical environment reflected these changes through alterations that seemed both arbitrary and deliberate, as if the institution had reconfigured its spatial layout to accommodate the silent transformation of its internal narrative. Corridors once used for routine passage were rerouted through alternate paths, though no construction had taken place. Offices previously central to operational planning were reassigned to peripheral tasks, their windows frosted to obscure interior activity. Storage rooms became temporary workspaces without explanation, their contents rearranged to create a sense of impermanent order. These changes accumulated to produce an architecture shaped not by function but by the need to redistribute memory across space, diffusing the impact of the anomaly through a pattern of controlled displacement. Personnel adapted to these changes with the same measured compliance that characterized their behavior, navigating the altered environment without seeking rationalization, as though the search for explanation itself posed a procedural risk. The film reels, now archived under their new classification, existed as silent anchors of the unresolved event, sealed within a system designed to preserve information without granting access. Their presence within the archive signified both the institution's acknowledgement of the anomaly and its refusal to confront its implications. The classification codes assigned to them ensured that they would remain untouched, accessible only to administrative layers that seldom engage with stored materials except in cases of procedural audit. The reels thus became artifacts of a history the institution had chosen to contextualize through absence, held in a space where information existed without narrative, preserved without interpretation. Their continued existence represented a paradox. The evidence was not destroyed, yet its meaning had been rendered inert through bureaucratic isolation. Gromov's movements through the altered environment carried the residual weight of what he had witnessed, though his behavior reflected the disciplined neutrality required to coexist with the institution's silence. His actions were measured, his expressions controlled, his responses calibrated to avoid drawing attention. Yet the internal impact of the anomaly manifested through subtle shifts in his perception of routine, the way he noted minor inconsistencies in documents, the flicker of recognition when he encountered procedural changes that echoed the institution's earlier adjustments. His presence became a living record of the unresolved event, not through action but through the tension embedded in his compliance. The institution had restructured itself around the anomaly, yet it had not dissolved his connection to it. Instead, it had repositioned him within a liminal space where memory persisted beneath the surface of disciplined routine. The aftermath settled into a form of equilibrium that carried the appearance of stability but revealed its fragility through details that resisted assimilation, details that lingered at the edges of routine like faint echoes of an event no one would articulate. Personnel avoided certain hallways without knowing why, documents required signatures that served no clear purpose, and administrative procedures evolved in ways that suggested the presence of a new, unrecorded logic. The discovery had not been confronted. It had been dispersed, absorbed into the institution's structure until it became indistinguishable from the silence surrounding it. Yet its influence remained, embedded in the distortions of daily life, the spaces where people no longer spoke freely, the restrained movements of those who understood that the event had altered not only procedure but perception. The narrative closed not with resolution but with a tone of unresolved tension and quiet dread, shaped by the recognition that Gromov had encountered only the first thread of a larger mystery, one the institution had chosen to bury beneath layers of procedural adaptation rather than confront directly. The historical echo of the discovery persisted through fragments, partial documents, redacted reports, sealed archives, and the unvoiced scars carried by those who had witnessed what should not have existed. These fragments formed the outline of a truth preserved not in records but in the subtle distortions of an institution shaped by silence, leaving the sense that the anomaly had not been contained but merely displaced, waiting in the periphery of history for the moment when its presence would resurface through another unexplained image, another procedural irregularity, or another individual who encountered what no system had been designed to comprehend.